Great. Well, hi, everyone. It is my honor to be able to introduce Dr. Gillian Bowser as this month's Ecology Center speaker. Dr. Bowser is an ecologist in the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. But that really doesn't even begin to describe her contributions or her experience. So before moving to Fort Collins, almost 15 years ago now, she spent more than 2 decades as a biologist with the National Park Service. She worked in several charismatic megaparks like Yellowstone and Grand Teton, Wrangell St. Elias, and then facilitated research collaborations with university partners down in the Gulf Coast. And that's actually, I think, where we first met.
I think so, yeah.
So that was a while ago. But, and then, like I say, 15 years ago, went to Colorado State. So these days, her research is focusing on the effects of global change on pollinators and looking at biodiversity and high elevation ecosystems. But when I think of Gillian's most important influence on the field of ecology, my thoughts immediately turn to her work on community engagement and broadening participation. She's published important papers on citizen science, on ecology education, and on improving the inclusion and success of underrepresented students in ecology. Her talk today is going to focus on both of these kind of her research themes and her engagement themes, and I'm really excited to hear what she has to tell us. So I invite you to join me in virtually welcoming her today.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think it was the Gulf Coast Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit. That's where we actually met. That was a while ago. So thank you for that. I mean, this is going to be a fun talk, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm really sorry I could not be there in person. Got some family challenges going on in New York, but it is great fun to talk about this topic and hopefully get everybody excited about thinking things. So I gave the title of the talk, and hopefully someone can keep track of time for me because I can't see it on the screen. And let me know if there are any questions. Feel free to pop a question in the chat and interrupt or whatever. So I want to talk about pollinators and citizen science. And as someone can see, I've got my Pollinator Hotshots t-shirt on because a lot of what we do now is looking at pollinators in national parks. It's a great way to think about things as we look at changing climates, environmental challenges, et cetera, because citizen science suddenly opens the door to different ways of thinking about science. So I'm going to talk a bit about broadening perspectives and participation in what we're calling the applied sciences. And our real thought is to end this talk with thinking about people protect what they love. And to use that term love, because it's really important that people protect what they love and think about that in terms of citizen science. So a little bit about my own background, which Mark gave you a little bit. Again, I'm an associate professor here at Colorado State University in the Department of Ecosystems and Sciences. So Mark will get a giggle because we actually think it's Department of Soil and other things, because most people here study soil and not necessarily the people associated with soil. I was with the Park Service for quite some time. I actually spent a year with year plus with the U.S. State Department as a AAAS fellow. And then I've been debate not only the megafaunal parks, but also worked in some of the microfaunal parks like Lewis and Clark. That's just a small park along the West Coast. I also worked in the Washington, D.C. office and other offices. So, parks are sort of my meat and potatoes. I've worked with parks for a very long time, and now I take all my students back to parks and we work on parks. So the subtext of this talk is, I like to call it eyes wide open, because I think we don't keep our eyes open. When we talk about DEI, it's very much a trend right now. We don't necessarily think about the positive sides, the love of things that cause people to engage or disengage. And so think about eyes wide open as the story of love, pollinators, and citizen science in 4 parts. The first part, thinking about who's a community. And again, that pretext that I work with parks. And so this is a acute challenge to think about who is a community in a park. And part 2 is who participates in what? And why does that matter? Why does that participation change things? And then, of course, the big aha for me, and the end of the story is, again, people protect what they love, but also small things tell. There we go, unmuted. So the small things tell big stories, or the participation of tiny. And I think citizen science has changed that story landscape, where we now can tell stories with really tiny things because our cell phones are pretty darn good at taking pictures of little tiny things. So in my 4 parts, I want to start with that subtext that people protect what they love. And pollinator science, or pollinator data in citizen science, is highly biased because of that. So we talk about pollinators writ large, but it's important to remember people protect what they love. That leads to a bias. That bias depends on the story. The story can tell you which culture, or tell you about a culture, and the culture then connects to those people. And thinking about that process, and thinking about that passage through, is really important when we think about pollinators, because people take pictures of what they love, or what they're interested in. And that picture becomes our citizen science data. So if we are to use that data, we need to understand where that bias comes from and why that bias occurs. So my talk also has 2 big subtexts to think about. One is that all landscapes have a culture. All landscapes have a culture, and all cultures have a landscape. And it's important in today, as we talk about indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and local knowledge, that we think about every landscape has all 3. And those 3 may not also be in agreement, as some of those members of the 3 are still there, and some of the members of the 3 are not there. But then how do you balance all that with what you want to do to protect that landscape, or to protect that culture, or protect that heritage, and more importantly, to tell a story about small things like pollinators? So let's walk through some slides. And again, I can't quite see the text, so either one of the hosts can interrupt me if a question pops up, and I'll happily stop to answer it. But part 1, I wanted to start with was taking that deep breath to think about who is the community. And as I mentioned, when we talk about national parks, we think we know who the community is, but it's not always very clear on who the community is and why that who matters to how you manage in a national park. So thinking about that, a community can have all these different characteristics that we have to think about when we look at citizen science. So one of them is that, is it a physical space? Does it actually sit in one place? And very often we talk about indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities, we're thinking about a space, a physical space. Again, all landscapes have a culture, and all cultures have that landscape. But it could be a cultural group on a landscape that may be there for a short, long, medium period of time. That is now the community. But that community may now also be different than the researcher or the person asking the question, like the park manager, or a researcher, or a graduate student, or whoever. And how does that change if you're not a member of that community, but you're asking a question about the community? Or is the community extinct? Is it a memory space? That's all that's left of where that community was and why that community was there. And what is that? Why should that matter? And then the last one to think about is, what happens if that community has no boundaries? And it takes a moment to pause and think about, what if that community is global? It's everybody. And then how are we asking questions, and what does that community science then actually start to mean? So I'd like to start with this, and I don't know if Jack Green is in the audience, but many of you know Jack. So we've got our traditional pictures of Jack. But thinking about this definition of a community, why does it matter? How old is a community? What does it look like? What do we need to be mindful of? And what are the potential impacts of changing that perspective? It's because there's very often a story. And that story defines, or is defined by the community, however the community itself is defined, and it defines the resources. And people protect what they love. So if you look at this picture of Jack, it's Jack in a tree. But if I told you all that probably every one of you in this room actually knows the physical space of this tree, or knows the name of this physical space of this tree, and if You don't remember your name. Your children probably remember the name of this physical space and tree because it tells a story, and it tells a children's story. So the reason why this is important is because it changes our perspective of a landscape and what we protect, what we take pictures of, and how we think of that citizen science when we know the story behind the landscape. So this is Sherwood Forest. And this is one of the trees that Robin Hood hid behind or hid in. So when you think about that, this is this place that's now thousands of years old, that's 1,000 and change years old. The tree is incredibly old. So who is the community of this forest? Is, you know, a royalty that's pretty much gone extinct. Or, well, I shouldn't say that, but is not necessarily in that space anymore. And there's a different community there. But the children's story has made the Sherwood Forest global. So everyone knows the story of Robin Hood and men, but they may not know a Sherwood Forest. I mean, I've thought about the resources and how they take a picture or how we protect the Sherwood Forest. So who is the community? And the community, in terms of the protection of a resource, can be celebration or it can be painful. This is a picture of the Sinai Peninsula, which is also a national park. So just by saying the name Sinai Peninsula changes your impression, and you can think about the challenges that this park faces and trying to define who the community is for this park. And when you protect this park, which includes one of the most rich, this is part of the Red Sea, rich coral reefs in the world, how do you protect this park? Who is this park being protected for? And how does this all matter? And where that gets back to thinking about when we get to, you know, citizen science and people taking pictures of what they love and they protect what they love, is even in our own national parks, we've evolved that thought about the community. Who do we serve? And why do we serve a community over time? So I've just put the two mission statements of our national parks. One is from 1916 and the other one is from 1998. So 1916 is the Establishment Act of the National Park Service, and the second one is called the General Omnibus Act. And there are two things that to pay attention to in these acts in terms of our change as a culture and our change as an American culture as how we view our national parks and protected areas. And the first is simply leaving everything in place, the natural and historic object and the wildlife therein, and leaving them unimpaired as a vignette for the future. While the second is to conserving unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and the values of the national park system for their enjoyment, education, and inspiration of people. So we're defining all this now based on inspiration. We're defining it now in terms of a value. And so when we talk about pollinators, we actually are talking about the same things. We value certain pollinators, we value why they're there, and we take pictures of some, but maybe not others. So thinking about traditional and local knowledge, it's important that all cultures have a landscape, and that landscape changes that perspective. And so I love this quote from the new African, well, it's not new anymore, African American Museum of African American Culture and History in DC, about God created people and God created Black people and Black people create style. So you change the thought about that landscape in terms of where a culture on the same landscape might think of itself as style. And you only have to go down to New Orleans and go to Barataria Preserve, which is a coastal preserve in New Orleans, or go to the New Orleans Jazz Museum, which are separated by themselves by maybe a couple of miles, and see two definitions of a landscape and two definitions of how a culture reflects that landscape. So that was my part one. Who is the community? The community varies, and the community depends on how you define it. And there's no good or bad, it's just different. And it's important that we think about when we look at citizen science on who is that community and why they're participating makes a difference. So I want to spend a little bit of time on broadening perspectives. And these are two different things. And we tend to lump it all together and say broadening perspectives and broadening participation. Yay, those are two things. But let's split them apart and think about why broadening perspectives is different than participation. And that gets back to my issue of defining that community. So I started this part with thinking broadening perspectives is not what you think. It's not just about changing the face of who is doing the science, but maybe it's more deep than that. So the stories I think, are the most important thing to think about when you think about perspective, because people define the landscape. We define the conservation of that landscape. So our perspective brings into place what we see and what we protect and what we preserve. So this is from Nicodemus, where the first perspective of an African-American pioneer in 1800s was the scenery was not at all inviting, and I began to cry. So that was the western part of the Great Plains. This is Nicodemus, Kansas. And to think about how that person saw that landscape and go back to Nicodemus, Kansas now and ask, what is the connection of an African-American perspective to that landscape and what they saw versus what they see now? And why is that important? But I'd like to share that perspective with thinking about how an object that could be small and fairly uniform and not very exciting can also tell a story that changes your perspective of a landscape, or how another way a story of a landscape can be told. So this is a picture of pots and pans, and they're very old, and they've been around for a long time. And it's a display in a museum. And why I like this story, and I love this picture, is because they probably have pots that we all can relate to or look very similar to something that we have in our own story. So we can connect to the story of a pot and assume that that story is going to be about cooking. And we can assume that story is going to be about food and what the food that's being prepared in a kitchen might look like and who is preparing that food. But if I tell you that these are all pots in the same kitchen, they were excavated through several layers of kitchens that have been in the same place for over 1,000 years. All these pots. This is the Vatican, and this is the Vatican's kitchen. So it changes your perspective of this pot and pan just to think about what food has been in there, but more importantly, that it's this one place. It's a story of a layer of one activity in one place over time. So when you think about resources like fishing or birding, et cetera, that may take place in the same place over time, then the power of that story about that same place, so it's this geographic place, now changes the aspect of the element itself and how we think about it. So now you may go out and take pictures of pots and think about, how can I tell a citizen science story about pots? It's probably using the same metric to tell the citizen science story about pollinators. It's just fun to think about. So part of this is thinking about new stories or very old stories, but more importantly, I also want you to think about untold stories or newly told stories. And obviously, as a woman of color myself, an African-American from the fantastic city of Brooklyn, New York, I'll talk about Brooklyn in a bit, is that these untold stories are ways of perspectives that we sometimes tend to overlook in the conservation of an organism or conservation of a place. And newly told stories are also equally guilty of overlooking or putting to the side what stories might have an important perspective. And we'll talk about some examples there on why newly told stories, such as the newly told role of women in science, that's a very different story we'll talk about, versus untold stories, the role of African-American silent films that were all filmed in South Dakota in the early 1900s that told the story about Western civilization through an African-American perspective. So why do these stories matter? It's going back to the Genesis theme here, that people tell stories based on what they love and their culture. But citizen science is bound by those same stories. People take pictures of what they love. And what they connect to is why they take pictures. And I'm talking about the citizen science field where you have non-expert participants participating in something, either like it's a BioBlitz or it's a focused survey where you're asking them, like pollinators, please take pictures of pollinators and upload them if you see them, so we can find out if that pollinator is still available or not. So citizen science is based on this issue of perception. It's entirely based on perception. And the perception is entirely based on a bias. And I think it's really important that citizen science as a field gets to understand that bias is connected to a culture, and a culture is connected to love. So a great example, these are from BioBlitzes, is that you can say, well, bumblebees and urban people don't see a whole lot of bumblebees. They're not very connected to them, but maybe they are. And if we take a BioBlitz and connect everybody through that BioBlitz to something that's in their own backyard, we have a larger conservation questions about pollinators writ large, because those species do occur in both settings. It's just the cultures are different in those two different settings. So citizen science is biased by love, and that love is biased because of how people participate. It's based on their culture, which is based on the community that has defined that landscape. So I think it's important as we think about that as biologists and ecologists, we step back and say, okay, am I going to get every pollinator out there using citizen science to understand that you're going to get pollinators that are biased by love? And that bias is important for us to then work with, to be able to answer the question, are pollinators declining or increasing in urban versus rural settings? It depends on which types of data we actually get back. So I want to take a minute to talk about this issue of stories and story listening and data, and we'll dive more into this tomorrow about just why this understanding of bias in data is so important. Is that in some places of stories, like Nicodemus, has multiple layers and multiple cultures, and our management of those multiple layers and multiple cultures is confounded by these different issues. So there's no necessarily right or wrong answer, and you may have multiple stories sitting on top of each other, and then trying to figure out that perspective and why that perspective matters. So here, for example, is a little story. And if you look at this picture, where I tell you the title of the story, it's the one thing that's not in this picture, but it's a critical part of the story. And this is a picture of glacial retreat in the high elevation mountains of Peru. And again, there's no glacier in this picture, but the retreat impacts livelihood that consists of two parts. One is the traditional livelihood in the mountains, and the second is tourism, mountaineering tourism. And both of those are in this picture. So the picture is telling a complicated story, but we need to listen to that story to get to the question about, okay, what's happening with the ecosystem itself, because these two stories are colliding, the tourism, the local community, and the retreat, third story, of glaciers all at the same time. And part of the issue here is as the glaciers retreat, they change wetlands, and the wetlands change grasses, the grasses change livestock, and they also change the stability of areas for people to hike through for mountaineering, with the high elevation avalanches being more and more common. So story listening should be part of our research design as we design citizen science. And think about it, because we need to listen to the stories, because that changes our perspective of that place. And it should be a process. We've used the term co-produced, and I was just in a session recently, and people talk about co-produced knowledge and environmental justice issues, but that's not the same as story listening. Story listening is really a lot about telling us why that perspective matters in the conservation of a place, or the answer of a conservation question like pollinator loss. And then when we go back to add that citizen science in, the community engages because we've listened to their stories. So we know why this is important to them. And that story helps them or relive that cultural collection. So a simple organism like the monarch actually does that. It moves across landscapes. It connects people in different stories. You can find them in New York City. You can find them in downtown Brooklyn. You can find them in Grand Tetons, if you look hard, all at the same time. And that butterfly is identifiable in people's stories and people's connection to a landscape. And people take pictures of it because it's a beautiful butterfly and they want to protect what they love. Okay, part 3 is broadening participation. And I want us to think about broadening participation 2 ways, not just who asks the questions, which is a lot of what DEI talks about, but also who answers the question. And this is why I have pictures of a lot of bugs here. And broadening participation is getting us to tie these two things back together and think about why broadening participation is part of the research question, as part of the design of citizen science, also changes the participation of the tiny or different things. So broadening perspectives changes what we think about to conserve. Broadening participation is changing who's involved in the conversation. But 2 things, and story listening is one of these ways we try to connect these 2 things. What is the perspective? And then how does it help us change who's involved in the conversation? So listening to those unheard stories and who's telling the stories matter when we then dive into what the story itself is trying to tell us to conserve or to protect over time. And a great example of this, and one of the, I think, core examples is the change in the participation of women in sciences, and particularly in the environmental sciences. And for just a little piece of hardcore data, right now women have made fantastic strides in the environmental science fields, but it's mostly white women who make up almost 60% of our environmental workforce, where women of color have not moved at all. So when we think about broadening participation, we have a better gender balance in the environmental sciences, but we haven't broadened the perspective of the different cultural stories and how those cultural stories may change. So there's one example where broadening participation and broadening perspective are really two very different things. Changing the gender of our workforce, or a gendered workforce that currently is more balanced, at least in terms of male and female, and there are other elements in there as well. But we haven't addressed the perspective the same way, where the perspective of male and female or different gender may be balanced, but we haven't changed the perspective of people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds in the sciences at this point in time. So when we go back to that, we're hoping to get towards what we call climate action. And I threw in a couple of technical terms in here that, again, hopefully we'll be able to talk about tomorrow. And one of these is called the nationally determined contributions, which are called NDCs. And you can happily look these things up. If you type in the NDC for the United States, you'll end up on the NDC webpage for the United Nations, which sits under the Paris Agreement. When we think about climate change, we think about the climate change and the Paris Agreement as interconnected, interwoven, and inseparable. And the thing that connects them is a nationally determined contribution. And you're probably thinking, so what the heck does this have to do with pollinators and citizen science? It gets back to two things. People protect what they love, but also recently, as in Glasgow 2 years ago, nature was added as one of these protection elements through a term called nature-based solutions, and that's the Glasgow Climate Pact that sits on top of the Paris Agreement. And why that's important is two: number one, it needs citizen science to be able to answer this question. But number two, it's based on the community to define the question to begin with. What a nature-based solution is local. It's a local landscape, and that local landscape is embedded in culture. And understanding that local landscape is embedded in culture means you need to understand the community. So for example, a national park. If the community is global, the action needs to be local because the park has a physical boundary in space and time. But what happens if the resource, like a pollinator, is also not local, happily moves around, has impacts on a national theme through our food security by pollinating our food crops, but the community is global because it's a national park. So understanding how that data is going to move is really important. And we'll talk a little bit about that again when we talk about how you validate data. One of the things that we find is data validation is international and global, even though the data is collected local. And that's an interesting, unique characteristic of citizen science, that your validation to make your species accurate may take place for most bumblebees by the National Museum of Singapore. They are the specialists on bumblebees, and they identify most bumblebees. Fascinating, right? So the solution is global, but the information is collected local. Okay, so I want to sort of close down with thinking about participation of the invertebrate many. When we look at the bias of our culturally infused citizen science now, it all comes down to what we take pictures of and how we get these things into data sets to begin with. And then, like I just mentioned, how we get these things to accurate species is actually going back to a global community versus a local one who may be taking the pictures, and understanding how we intersect these two things, because now we've got two different cultural biases moving in. So participation in the invertebrate many is a great little saying, because it gets us to think about who actually is doing the hard work here. And I didn't have a good picture of an earthworm. An earthworm probably beats most of the pollinators cold in terms of their ability to reduce carbon. But it's important that we think about, we talk about local solutions to reducing carbon and nature-based solutions. The number one thing is intact ecosystems that are functioning. And one of the biggest components of an ecosystem that helps us do that is these little guys. And you get into the soil microbes and everybody else, but also pollinators that are moving around the plant systems, et cetera, et cetera. So when we get into this idea of carbon reduction being local and nature-based solutions, we're going to have to dive into, okay, but it's not everybody. It's this cultural bias of who we can get data for, which is a sum of the participation of the invertebrate many. So part 4, my last part, is small things tell big stories. And what is the role of all these little tiny guys in global pollinator decline, and why does it matter at a local level? And I'll give you some clues just looking at the pictures that are on this slide. Number one, starting from my left-hand side, it might be your right, I'm not sure, but it's my left. A cute little butterfly of the fritillary group. Small butterfly, likes riparian areas, very common. So it's telling one story. People like to take pictures, they're very beautiful. Up in the top corner, we have a solitary bee, the cuckoo bee group. You can tell by its little mustache. And there's a bee that is a darn good pollinator that most people can't identify. Very hard to identify. And then in our middle, we have, I guess I could arguably say, and I'll probably get corrected by some of my taxonomic friends here, but let's just say for now, this is one of these small little guys, highly accurate pollinator that nobody knows, and probably most people misidentify. And these are these little syrphid flies. And they're pretty darn good at getting things moving together. And then we also have the squash bees in the same group, which would connect to everything you ever thought about doing for Halloween, or zucchini breads and the like, but we haven't really thought about how those things got there. And then the right-hand side are 2 bumblebees, and these are both from the Andes. And why they're interesting is one is moving up, and the other one, we're not quite sure what it's doing, but it seems to be declining and disappearing. So the one in the bottom corner is a lowland species that has decided that climate change is pretty darn good in its view of the world, and has moved up to approximately 16,000 feet above sea level. The upper one is the Andean bumblebee, which only occurs at the high elevation. We don't know what the intersection of these two are yet, but one is quite big, quite charismatic. The other one is quite small, so you can see by the scale, and harder to identify. That gets into that bias question. So we go into small things tell big stories about climate change and nature-based solutions, understanding things like the bumblebee shift, how things move, warmer species replacing cooler species, things moving around. All of these are early warning systems, and all of these are happening quite quickly because invertebrates have very short lifespans, and they can do wild and crazy things like have several generations in 1 year. Think pine bark beetle for us Western Coast people. And these shifts are early warnings of some impact on ecosystem function. And understanding how these organisms shift is not easy. So 2 of these pictures here are bees that potentially are declining or in trouble on an invasive plant, which is a thistle. So here it becomes a sort of cultural issue, a culture of the National Park Service. We need to destroy all non-native plants like thistles. But what do you do when you have an endangered bumblebee using the same thistle, and how do you manage that space? So that's our conundrum. Managing nature-based solutions, figuring out that the really tiny things really matter. Then how do we tell the story of those little tiny things? And how do we bring that cultural infusion, both in participation, as well as those perspectives of different people on the landscape, and how all that comes together on how people take pictures? So I wanted to sort of end a little bit with the story of the monarch, because the monarch is a great story. And I like to say, but the monarch is a story of a not very good pollinator. It's like, what was it, the hungry caterpillar type story, or the ugly duckling type story? Is, the beginning result is not the end result that you may have thought of. The monarch is not very good at pollinating for a whole pile of reasons, but it helps us tell a story because a monarch moves through cultures, places, and people love them. So they take pictures of them so we can track them. So the monarch is a great example of pollinators and citizen science that tell a story about conservation, but may not be the best for telling the ecosystem story because they're not very good pollinators from a plant's perspective, but they tell a story that can help us protect a group writ large because it tells the story of what people love and what people are willing to protect by taking pictures and loading these in citizen sized data sets so we can answer the question about decline. So to sort of close things down, some really good pollinators are really tiny, and tiny things tell big stories, and they're hard to see, they're hard to take pictures of, they're hard to identify. But these little tiny guys are responsible for most of our food crops. In the temperate zone, think a lot of trees and fruits, blueberries, watermelon, squash. It goes on in the tropics. You've got, mangoes and other things or avocados that are all heavily dependent on wild pollinators. And we know very little about them. So we can't yet answer the question, is pollinator declining? Though we'd like to think we can answer it, because we have what's called systematic data gaps, which the Glasgow Climate Pact, interestingly enough, allows us to address. And the National Park Service actually just did that in using our infrastructure bill to say we have to pay attention to small things because pollinators are declining and we don't know yet why or how widespread this is. So the Park Service has submitted bills as part of our nationally determined contribution to figure out why pollinators are declining. And it's entirely dependent on citizen science. So we have to understand this bias. Okay, so basically I wanted to sum it up. Small things tell big stories. High elevation bees is one example of these stories, but how they're shifting is an important big story about climate change and other things. And as this glacial retreat, which is again a big story, is moving, or what some people call slow onset climate change, these small things can help us connect the public to the landscape, to the story. So the community has a perspective of that story at the same time. And then last one, which I'll close with, a project sort of near and dear to our heart and close nearby, and this is looking at small blue butterflies, sagebrush and ants. And what I wanted to say about this project, and some of you may know this and some may not, is that the sagebrush habitat is considered now as potentially endangered for a whole pile of reasons, or I think it's imperiled is the term that's used. Because sagebrush restoration is having sort of mixed ups and downs on what it's restoring to. And one of the things that is disappearing off of sagebrush restoration sites are little tiny blue butterflies. And why this is interesting is that little tiny blue butterflies, in terms of the stories, are one of the few groups of butterflies that actually are listed under our Endangered Species Act, the Carmen's blue and the Xerces blue, for example. But the blue butterfly actually only uses grass for a host plant. So unlike the monarch butterfly, you cannot argue that something like cheatgrass is bad for blue butterflies because they're pretty unconcerned about which grass they use. The secret of the blue butterflies is that their caterpillars are often, 75% of the time, raised by ants. So if you remove the ants, you remove the blue butterflies. And if you restore a habitat and not pay attention to the ants, you don't restore the butterflies. So understanding this complexity of a habitat and getting people to maybe take pictures of blue butterflies will answer or help us answer a question about a large-scale shift in a habitat critical to the United States, or especially the Western United States. So this little tiny blue butterfly is telling a rather large story about sagebrush restoration and sagebrush stability throughout the Western United States. And it's very close, basically nursery nanny that takes care of the blue butterfly or the ants. So all landscapes have this culture, and all cultures have a landscape associated with it. And understanding these intersections of landscape and culture are part of our next challenge in the climate change debate, and where citizen science can help us address questions like pollinator decline and the impact on human society. And as we think about the stories and how we can get people to connect to small stories, here's a very kind of boring looking butterfly on the outside. If you open up, it has beautiful orange wings. And this is the painted lady butterfly that migrates actually further than many monarchs do. in a single lifetime. And no one knows much about this little butterfly, but we probably all seen the 2 different species of painted ladies that occur in the United States. So all these landscapes have cultures, all cultures have landscapes, and connecting all to citizen science and the power to tell that story is sort of part of our message on pollinators and citizen science. So in closing, hopefully I have time for questions. I want to make sure I acknowledge the amazing students who have participated over, and Jack can help me out because he's been involved in this for the last 12, 13 years in 2 projects called the Pollinator Hotshots, who collected thousands of images, literally thousands. We just went through data sets of over 90,000 images for 8 national parks to try and answer the question about pollinator decline using citizen science data sets. And these students are amazing, are going on to do amazing things, and part of that broadening participation, but also helping us broaden our perspective of pollinators as they move up and through the workforce. And with that, just a shout out to the National Science Foundation for funding us. I'd see if there are any questions, and thank you so much for listening and giving me the time to talk about, obviously, my passionate project of pollinators and citizen science. So thank you so much.